Hello everyone, my name is the Phawx. In this review we'll be looking at the Gamesir T4 Pro. If there was ever a perfect example of jack of all trades and master of none, this controller would find itself firmly on display. I find myself at odds to recommend this controller at all. Most of the inputs are serviceable, but I find the D-pad to be inadequate. This is going to be one of those reviews where I'll need to qualify if it's worth getting. I can make it 100% easy for you. If you find yourself with a real need on a satisfactory D-pad, look elsewhere. However, if you need an inexpensive controller that can operate on a fleet of different platforms with the click of 2 buttons, perhaps this controller might serve a purpose for you. Let me explain. Let's start off what this controller does really well. The Gamesir T4 Pro takes the kitchen sink approach to third-party controllers. At a glance, it adopts a traditional Xbox 360 style with Nintendo Pro controller trappings. Thankfully, the lighting isn't too crazy and is what I consider to be a tasteful touch of RGB lighting. The overall build quality and weight distribution are for all intents and purposes what would be considered standard. For me, this is actually a negative, and I'll explain why in a moment. Past these features, we start getting into some of the wise decisions that Gamesir made with this controller. First is the inclusion of the mobile phone grip as well as grooves on the top of the controller to mate the grip. What's nice here is they've purposefully left an opening for the USB-C port to still be accessible even in this configuration. Another important note here is when plugging the USB-C connection in, the controller switches to a wired state completely. This particular function, unfortunately, only applies to PC and Android, both of them connecting as a wired Xbox 360 controller. The last bit of extra value-added features on this controller is the inclusion of 4 buttons on the back of the controller that can be reprogrammed to whatever you wish, with a few caveats. Both PC and Android allow a combination of buttons to be mapped to the back buttons, while the Nintendo Switch only allows a single button to be remapped. For Apple iOS, these buttons don't function at all. Topping it all off with arguably the best feature of this controller, it supports Android, PC, Apple iOS, and the Nintendo Switch. One huge quality of life feature I really love on this controller is the pre-printed hotkeys for pairing to different systems. This way you never actually really need the manual at all. Only if you need it for tweaking RGB lighting or if you wanted to reprogram the back buttons. The one negative thing that I'm going to mention here is I really wish the controller had the ability to remember which system it connected to last in a previous mode. Let me explain. If you're in iOS mode and then switch to Android, when you switch back to iOS, you have to completely repair the controller to the device. That's one thing I took for granted. It's not a deal breaker, but in my head, it took the usefulness out of the device down a bit. To clarify, you do not have to repair the device if you stay in the same mode. As an example, if you pair in Android mode and turn the controller off, just pressing the home button will auto-attempt to repair to your Android device that was already pre-configured. This part is seamless as you would expect. That's pretty much everything that's great about the device. It's a solid, super versatile, inexpensive controller. However, let's talk about the inputs. We just have to talk about the D-pad here. It's bad. It's really not good. It's mushy. It's often enough not accurate when pushing any of the diagonals. It's just poor. Which might be okay if you largely just want to use the analog sticks, but I am also not really a fan of the analog sticks as well. It's a bit odd that they copied a large part of the Xbox 360 controller and didn't copy the same 360 analog sticks. The sticks on the Gamesir T4 can be slippery, the tension is a bit off-balanced. It's passable, but it's just not great. The L2 and R2 buttons are thankfully analog in PC and Android mode, and the face buttons themselves are actually really solid as well. And again, the RGB lighting is really nice. The back buttons also line up quite nicely with the middle finger resting comfortably in between. But still, the D-pad and analog sticks are absolutely critical in a controller, and having lackluster fidelity in this aspect is the largest area where I find that I can't recommend this controller at all. However, let's return to my original statement. How would I recommend this device? Again, if you absolutely must have a solid D-pad and analog, this isn't the controller for you. However, perhaps you want to buy a standard controller for your kid on the Nintendo Switch. Because of the included gyros on that board, it can absolutely do everything a Nintendo Switch Pro controller can do at half the cost. Maybe you have a Switch Pro controller, but your kid is too young and just drops controllers, and you'd rather give them a working facsimile that you don't care about that much. One thing I wanted to mention here real quick about the gyro, I did attempt to use the new Flickstick PC software with the controller in PC mode as well as in Switch mode, but neither functioned, which was a bummer. Getting back on track and talking about usefulness of this device, maybe you just want to have an all-rounder controller in an Xbox 360 package, including the ability to, whenever you want, clip this controller to your phone. Which brings me to the last negative point of this review. This controller needs to be heavier on the bottom portion. While the clip does extend fairly large and can accommodate phones with cases, what winds up happening is a device that is tremendously top-heavy and feels awkward to use. If they had weights that could be added to counter this weight, I think this would alleviate the issue completely. The Gamesir T4 Pro can be used on Switch, iOS, Android, and PC. On top of the wide selection of platforms this controller easily connects and works on, there are a host of value-added options that really help to sell the controller. Unfortunately, it falls pretty flat on the very basic premise of movement in games. Quite literally, the Gamesir T4 Pro is the jack of all trades and master of none.